Today we're going to welcome back to the library Professor Peter Boykin, who is a professor at Wayne County Community College, where he's been for the past 20 years. He was born and raised in Detroit. I heard some of your earlier conversations about his point of origin within the city of Detroit. From there, he went on to earn his bachelor's degree in history from Hampton University and his master's degree, or rather I should say his first master's degree, from Howard University in secondary education. He then went on for a second master's degree at Michigan State University in public relations, and again has been a professor at Wayne County Community College for the past 20 years. He is married to Ms. Sheila Scott Boykin. So on behalf of your Ann Arbor District Library, I'd like to welcome Professor Peter Boykin.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for the one, let me just adjust my mic here, for the wonderful introduction. And I forgot to put in the introduction, and I will say this, I am a graduate of Cass Technical High School, the old Cass Technical High School, which is one of the most historic high schools in the city of Detroit. Well, the old one was a beautiful facility, and the new one is too. And actually, I have a brick from the old Cass Tech, so it brings back fond memories every time I look at that brick. So I have been here 3 times now. I came here back in June of last year for Juneteenth, and then Ms. Claire Gottsman, want to give kudos to her and the adult library services staff. I was brought back in October to speak on my great-great-grandfather, Johnson Chesnut Whittaker, who was one of the first African Americans to matriculate at West Point. He faced a court-martial, and that presentation is on the Ann Arbor Public Library's website. If you want more information about him, I will be glad to disseminate that at the end of this presentation. So now we will commence with this presentation today on the evolution of African Americans from slavery to freedom in Detroit, from 1701, when the city was founded, to 2001. So we're covering a 300-year period. And this picture here is of the Underground Railroad monument on the Windsor, Ontario side. Now there's another one right, over here at Hart Plaza, past the fountain. Okay, so slaves would cross the Detroit River when it was frozen. And a lot of them would go into Canada because they felt that the slave catchers from the south would find them up north. And from records that I've found, the actuality of that happening was very slim. Okay, the most vulnerable place they would be captured is Cincinnati, because you're right across from Kentucky. So we learned in Michigan history that the city was founded in 1701 by Antoine de la Motte Cadillac, a Frenchman. So in spite of Detroit being known for the Underground Railroad, which I will discuss in a few minutes, it had an ugly side with slavery. So we were no different than New York, New Jersey, or the Middle Colonies, which had slavery, okay? Slaves constituted about 10% of the city's population from its inception until the 1800s. William Macomb, thus who Macomb County is named after, had the largest number of slaves in Detroit with 26 up until the time of his death. Lewis Cass, for whom my high school and Cassopolis and Cass County were named for, in Cass Avenue in Detroit, was the territorial governor of Michigan and a U.S. senator, and he owned a slave and even defended it when he ran in 1854 for president of the United States. He ran on the Democratic ticket, and that's one of the reasons that he lost. Because back then the Republicans are now how the Democrats are. They were for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the Democrats are basically how the Republicans are now. They're for, segregation. On the right is Elizabeth Dennison Forth. She is one of the first documented slaves in the Detroit area. And when she became free, she moved out to Oakland County and owned property around Pontiac, which is the county seat. So Miss Dennison Forth has the distinction of being the first African-American woman in the state of Michigan to own property and the first in the whole United States. This is a graph of the number of slaves in Detroit's population from 1773 to 1782. So 1773, if you do the math, this is pretty much several decades after the founding of Detroit. It was founded in 1701, so we are talking about 72 years after. And there were 46 male slaves and 39 female slaves. Now let's look at 1782. There were 79 male slaves and 101 female slaves. You might ask, well, Professor Boykin, what types of roles did the slaves in Detroit have? Well, for number one, they did not have a plantation system. So pretty much they did the same task that their counterparts did on the East Coast. Like you had a lot of them who were, especially the men, who were body servants. They would fix the wig on the slave master. They would shave him, cut his hair. They would drive the carriage, okay? Of course, the women took care of the kids. They did the cooking. And men also did other odd jobs around the house, okay? These are the names of other slave-owning individuals or families in Detroit. And as you can see, a lot of them are the names of major thoroughfares in Detroit. The Bobian family, Joseph Campo, Elijah Brush, that is a picture of him on the right. The Rivard family, Livernois. And I was so astonished at Livernois because, as I was telling some of you earlier, I pretty much grew up in the northwest quadrant of Detroit around the Livernois 7-mile area, so I never fathomed that the area I grew up in, especially the major thoroughfare where my elementary school was off of and the cleaners my parents frequented, etc., was named after a slave owner. And then also DeQuinder. You learn in U.S. history that in 1787, this is after the French Native American War, 7 Years' War, you had a land ordinance that was created. So once the French were kicked out of the United States, there was a decree that said all territories west of the Appalachian Mountains, this is the Appalachian Mountains right here, all this was to not have slavery. At first, you had the indigenous people or Native Americans, and they got pushed further west of the Mississippi. And like I said earlier, Detroit still had slavery when the British came in and took over this area. John R. Williams was the first official mayor of Detroit in 1824 and was said to have owned slaves. And it wasn't until 11 years later, right before Michigan became a state, that Article 11 of the state constitution prohibited slavery. And you see here the listing of the Midwest states that were admitted into the Union. Ohio is the oldest, our neighbor to the south, 1803, and our other neighbor to the south, well, actually southwest, Indiana, 1816, Illinois, 1818, we're in the middle of the pack, 1836, 1837, Michigan, Wisconsin, 1848, and Minnesota was the last one in 1858. And yes, there were slaves even in Chicago and some of the other places in the Midwest, and I'm sure there's documentation on them, but right now we're focusing primarily on Detroit. Now we transverse into the Underground Railroad. Seymour Finney, for those of you who are from Detroit, remember there was a Finney High School on the east side of Detroit, and it has another name now, I forgot the name of it, but the old building was torn down, they put a new building in place of it. And another gentleman, George Baptiste, were prominent conductors in Detroit along the Underground Railroad. The reason why it was called the Underground Railroad is because travel was done at night. It was easier and you did not face being caught. In 1836, 13 free slaves split from the First Baptist Church to form Second Baptist, which is located in Greektown, off of Monroe and Bobian. It is the oldest African-American congregation in Michigan. The Boykin family, my family, when they migrated up here, they came up from Tennessee, but they made a stop in Grosse Ile and then came into the city of Detroit and lived around Black Bottom. And my great-grandparents and my grandfather worshiped at Second Baptist Church, and it's still in operation today. Then my home church, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, was established in 1841. And by that time, the Underground Railroad was still going on, but there really isn't much documentation that my church was involved in the Underground Railroad. It probably was, but I have not seen that information. Most of the information has been on Second Baptist and then First Congregational, which is shown on the left. It was established in 1844 and was an Underground Railroad station as well. And this church is still in existence. It's on Woodward Avenue in the Midtown Wayne State area. Now, both First Congregational and Second Baptist have Underground Railroad rooms in the basement that are open to the general public, but you have to arrange for a tour. I've seen the one at Second Baptist, but I've not seen the one at First Congregational. Now we move into the Great Migration to Detroit in the 20th century. So Detroit saw an exponential increase of African Americans due to the auto industry being a major source of employment. In 1910, there were 6,000 African Americans in Detroit. 10 years later, there were 41,000. Out of the 8,000 African American workers in Detroit during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1,675 were employed at the Ford Motor Company. This is a picture of workers at the Model T plant in Highland Park. But this wasn't the first Ford plant. The first one was on Piquette Street in the New Center area, and actually that building's been preserved into a museum. And then they moved about a 10-minute car ride up Woodward to Highland Park. And actually, part of that original plant is still in existence. It's abandoned. And they have, of course, the State Historical Landmark sign. And of course, from there, they went out to Dearborn. Now we look at the subject of housing apartheid in Detroit. And it starts with Dr. Ossian T. Sweet. He was born in 1895 in Bartow, Florida. Got his bachelor's degree from the HBCU Wilberforce University. That's one of the closest HBCUs to Detroit. It's 4 hours to the south of here, outside of Dayton, Ohio, off 75. And he got a medical degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C. He moved to Detroit and started his own practice in 1922. He left the city and came back 2 years later to affiliate with Dunbar Hospital, an African-American hospital. Detroit's hospitals were segregated. So back during that time, up until the 1950s, African-American residents couldn't go to Henry Ford. They couldn't go to Sinai Grace or Detroit Receiving. You had African-American run hospitals, and even at the majority hospitals, African-American physicians couldn't be on staff there. All right, so my father was born at one of the African-American hospitals, Parkside. The last African-American hospital in Detroit to exist was Southwest Detroit Hospital. That's where Mayor Coleman Young went. The building is abandoned. It's right off of 75 and 96, not far from the Ambassador Bridge. It's a silver building. You've probably seen it. So if you know where the old train station Corktown is, the old Southwest Detroit Hospital is not far from there. So getting back to this, when Dr. Sweet came home one day in September 1925, a white mob had ransacked the house, and Sweet fought back with his friends. They fired shots into the crowd, and one of the whites in the mob was killed. So the next year, before that, everyone was taken down to the Wayne County Jail, the old Wayne County Jail. Even Sweet's wife, who would later contract tuberculosis and die. So Dr. Sweet had Clarence Darrow. If you're familiar with the story of the Scopes monkey trial, the theory of evolution in Tennessee, where a science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee went on trial, Clarence Darrow represented Dr. Sweet. And the judge in the trial was Frank Murphy, for whom the Wayne County Courthouse is named for today. He was also U.S. Supreme Court Justice and Governor of Michigan. So in April 1926, Sweet and his friends were acquitted of all charges. So could you imagine, in 1926, an all-white jury awarding a settlement or allowing for an African-American who was trying to protect his home to go free. After this incident, like I said before, Sweet's wife died, so things pretty much weren't the same. He went into depression, and then the house was sold in 1958 to another family. And the family's last name was Baxter. The Baxter's son, actually, his name is Daniel, he has restored the house, and this year it will open up as a museum to the public. He has a foundation, and I went to an African American history program there back in 2019, where they award scholarships, and all the furniture in the house has been preserved as it was when the Sweets were living there. And it's located at Garland and Charlevoix on the east side of Detroit, about a 5-minute drive from Belle Isle, and not far from Grosse Pointe and the Chrysler Jefferson plant. Okay. Now, I just want to say real quickly, There are other cases where there were intimidation tactics used against African Americans, but the same year with Dr. Sweet, there was an African American doctor who was trying to move into a house on the west side of Detroit, and on moving day, the white neighbors came up and pointed a gun and put him on the ground and forced him to sign the deed back over. But Dr. Sweet decided not to retreat and fought back. Now we get into talking about African American religion in Detroit. One of the first denominations started in Detroit was the Nation of Islam. It was started in 1930 by Wallace Farad Muhammad, the gentleman on the left. He mysteriously disappeared, so then Elijah Muhammad, who was originally Elijah Poole, migrated to Detroit from Georgia and would lead the nation until his death in 1975. Mosque number 1 was their first temple, who started on Linwood Avenue in Detroit. And has moved around several times, and today it is located on Evergreen Road in 7 Mile in northwest Detroit. It's actually not far from the Northwest campus where I'm based at. One day I was driving home to Southfield and I passed by it, and I've been inquiring what happened, to Mosque number 1 because it had moved around so much. So mass following had grown to over 9,000 members in Detroit and Chicago, so it was regional for a minute, and then it moved to other American cities. So they moved their headquarters from Detroit to Chicago, where it is presently headquarters. They were pretty much a self-contained organization, and they had their own bakeries, they had their own restaurants, own businesses. They believed in self-determination to survive. So they promoted black nationalism and separation from mainstream America. Of course, one of their most famous members was Malcolm X. Okay, and actually Malcolm X and his brother spent a lot of time here in the Detroit area. As a matter of fact, also, there's a home that belonged to Malcolm X's family in Inkster that they're restoring. They talked about a lot on Channel 2, and it will also open this summer as a museum for the community to see. And I met Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz. She grew up in my church, Bethel AME, before she became a Muslim. And in 1996, she came to speak at my church right before she died, so it was definitely an honor to meet her. And I told her, I said, your husband was one of my heroes, and she almost went to tears. And when I heard her speak, I heard Malcolm speak, so it was really an honor to hear someone of that stature who grew up, in Detroit, speak. Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. So this was the nucleus of the African American community in Detroit. By the 20s, there were over 120,000 African Americans in the city. There are many nightclubs, including the Flame Show Bar. They entertained patrons and brought in nationally known entertainers. The Paradise Theater, which is today the DSO or Orchestra Hall, is the only remaining building or edifice from this era. And they had first-run African American movies shown, as well as having jazz artists perform like Billie Holiday, Count Basie, just to name a few. Barthwell Drugs started in Black Bottom, became the largest African-American owned drugstore chain in the United States, and it would last until the 1980s. So drugstores back there are a little bit different. Walgreens and CVS today. They also had ice cream fountains. Those of you who are older remember those. So you could get your prescriptions, then you could get ice cream, sandwiches. Okay, so that's what Barthwell Drugs, so they had their own ice cream at Barthwell Drugs. So on the left here is Hastings Street. We know this today as I-75. So Black Bottom, to give you a geographic perspective, started down where Ford Field is and went all the way up to about Warren in the Midtown area, all right? And that's the Hotel Gotham on the right. It was an African-American owned hotel and had a restaurant in there. White and African-American Detroit came to a head in 1943. You had a lot of whites migrating from the South because Detroit was the arsenal of democracy. So you had another migration with whites coming in from the South, as well as Eastern Europe working in the factories. So on June 20th, 1943, a skirmish broke out at Belle Isle Park between whites and African Americans. There was one rumor that an African American mother and her baby were thrown into the Detroit River. Another rumor was that a white woman was raped on the Belle Isle Bridge. It lasted for 3 days. The federal troops were brought in. 34 people were killed, including 25 African Americans. And $2 million in property damages were basically tallied. Two years later, there was a segregation case going on. So most of you in here remember Boblo Island. Those of you younger, before Cedar Point, before Kings Island, everybody from Detroit would go downtown and catch the Boblo boat to Boblo Island. It's a 30-minute ride, and Boblo Island is located in the middle of the Detroit River across from Amherstburg, Ontario. Okay, and when I was growing up, I used to catch the boat over by Joe Louis Arena, and then they moved the docks below the Ambassador Bridge at Livernois and Jefferson, right by Fort Wayne. Okay, but when the Boblo boat started, you would catch it down by where Hart Plaza is today. So 24-year-old Elizabeth Ray, who was an African-American woman, was going to celebrate with white classmates after completing secretarial school. They did not allow African-Americans on the boat due to race. After this was argued in the state Supreme Court in Lansing, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall represented her and won the case to desegregate the boat and the amusement park. So the boat and the amusement park would last for another 50 years, and Boblo would close officially in 1995. Now we get back to housing apartheid in Detroit. Now we move over to the west side. Orzo and Minnie McGee bought a home on Sebald Street, which is near like 94 Michigan Avenue. The neighborhood association had restricted covenants telling them they had to move because they were African American. So if you look at the deeds to homes in some of the higher end areas of Detroit, like Palmer Woods, Indian Village, or even Grosse Pointe, they would put in the deeds, they said, do not sell the home to Jews, do not sell to African Americans, anybody who's of non-white origin. And this was de facto illegal segregation in the North. In the South, it was de jure, which means by law. After the Supreme Court ruled against them, they hired Thurgood Marshall again, and pretty much by this time, he was the chief counsel of the NAACP and went back to the Supreme Court to challenge this case. It was ruled that this was a violation of the 14th Constitutional Amendment and struck down restrictive covenants. So there would be a Supreme Court case after this, Shelley versus Kramer, that dealt with restrictive covenants in St. Louis where segregation was legal, and they said, stop. This is unconstitutional. In spite of the de facto segregation in Detroit, there were bright sides to African American home ownership. And that started with Conant Gardens in northeast Detroit, located off 75 and 7 Mile. This was the first neighborhood that was built to allow African Americans to reside with no restrictions. So as you see here, they had ranch-style homes. It was supported by the Federal Housing Administration, and many of the middle-class African Americans in the city resided there. There was a family at my church, the Lewis family, that lived on Cherry Street over in this area. Walton Lewis, the husband, was owner of Lewis Thompson Agency. It was an African-American-owned insurance agency. They had their offices right across from Motown on West Grand Boulevard. And they were one of the many African-American-owned insurance agencies, so they lived over there. A lot of my paternal grandmother's friends lived over in Conant Gardens. Now we move over to the Boston Edison district. This became one of the first higher-end area of Detroit to integrate. Some of the prominent African Americans who resided there were Reverend Albert Klieg, who you see the house is on the left. He was affiliated with the Shrine of the Black Madonna bookstore, which was at Livernois and Davison, and the church, which is on Linwood. Prophet Jones, who was a minister. And on the right is the home of Berry Gordy, founder of Motown Records. Okay? And he would own that house up until the 1980s, 1990s. And it was said that when Michael Jackson was solo and performing, and he came to Detroit, he didn't want to stay in a hotel because we all know he was a very private person. Berry Gordy would let him stay at his home. And this was like in the 80s and even early 90s. And then Dr. Wendell Cox, a prominent African-American physician in Detroit, who we will talk about in a few minutes, who had another claim to fame. And I had family members that lived in that area too. My grandfather's house on West Chicago, and then my grandaunt was on the same street as Berry Gordy, West Boston, but she was on the other side of the Lodge Freeway. So when they built the Lodge Freeway, it did cut Boston Edison in half, but it didn't take away as many homes as I-75 did with Black Bottom, and that was through eminent domain. And of course, it was not just Black Bottom, it cut Mexican Town in half too. and also destroyed other ethnic neighborhoods around the country, like in Miami, okay, Overtown, in Richmond, Jackson Ward, I-95, okay, and then even in Atlanta, I-75, 85, cut through Sweet Auburn, where Dr. King grew up, okay? So it's all over. Motown Records, started by Berry Gordy Jr. Now, this is amazing. He had an $800 loan from his family in 1958, and he paid the family back within, I think, about 8 years, okay? And they were entrepreneurs. They owned a grocery store. They purchased several homes along West Grand Boulevard, just west of Henry Ford Hospital, that would become known as Hitsville, USA. Most of the town was local, and they became international stars. Then in 72, the company relocated to Los Angeles, but before they moved to LA in 72, they did expand. Like right where Little Caesars Arena is was the Motown Administration Building. When I went to Cass Tech, that building was there, but it was abandoned, and it had the blue logo right here of Motown. I remember one time walking over to Woodward Avenue, catching the bus, and I saw right at the entranceway had the blue M for Motown. Now here, you have Hitsville, USA, which is a museum. Actually, they're expanding it. They're going to build a huge visitor center behind it, even have a recording studio so that they can get back to local artists recording. So right up here at the top is the apartment Berry Gordy had above the studio, and that's Studio A right below. And it's a great tour. If you haven't been on it, you should definitely check it out. And right in front of it, they have like a walk of fame of all the artists. So I'm really ecstatic that Motown has expanded this museum. And what happened was, the story goes, in, I think it was about 1985, Esther Gordy Edwards, who was his sister, was still working at Motown, and a tour bus had come from Japan, and that gave her the idea to start the museum. And people come from all over the world to the Motown Museum. You have to make reservations because the line will go around the block, especially during the summertime. And also there was another record company here in Detroit called Invictus Records. It was founded by Holland Dozier Holland. Okay, the Holland brothers and Lamont Dozier left Motown and started Invictus Records, and that lasted from 1968 to about 1975. And their studio was located in northwest Detroit off of Grand River, and that building is gone. So there are no remnants of Invictus Records that are left. WCHB, this was the first African-American owned and operated radio station in Detroit. It was founded by Dr. Wendell Cox and Dr. Haley Bell. Thus, the call letters are the names of the owners. It would be a big promotion of the Motown sound locally. And the lady you see right here, Martha Jean the Queen, she was the first African-American disc jockey in Detroit. And after WCHB changed, she would be on WQHB out of Inkster, and it was on AM. Back then, AM played commercial music, because I remember when I was in grad school at Howard in DC, I could get WJR 760 at night because, you know, it's a clear channel. So it wasn't until the 80s that a lot of your commercial radio stations would be on FM. So by the 80s, CHB would end because WJLB was the major R&B station. It was on FM, and so was WGPR 107.5. So the station would be, this is WCHB, were reincarnated in the 90s on FM. It was brought back through this radio conglomerate called Radio One. It's based out of Washington, D.C., owned by Kathy Hughes, and they had several stations here in Detroit. So WCHB came back on air as an FM station. And WCHB FM used to be WJZZ 105.9. So the jazz station went away, and then they had a gospel station. This is Radio One. And then 105.9 became a hip-hop station, and they kept going back and forth. Now, WCHB then, by the 2000s, went back to AM as a black talk radio station. But then, about 6 or 7 years ago, Radio One sold all their stations in Detroit, and WCHB was unfortunately laid to rest. So it is now no longer in existence. This is one fact that is now being told more in history. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech was actually given here in the Detroit area first, downtown at Cobo Hall. Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, And Reverend Clay came together with UAW President Walter Reuther to have a march down Woodward Avenue in June '63. And there were over 125,000 people there. So those who couldn't get in the old Cobo Arena would sit outside, and they had megaphones so for them to listen. Okay, so here's, let's see, I think this is, that's Walter Reuther, and there is Dr. King, okay, and there's Berry Gordy. And it was recorded on Motown Records. I participated in the 50th anniversary commemoration of this in 2013, and then in 2023, last year, they had a 70th anniversary commemoration of this march. By '67, things in the city turned in a different direction. On July 23rd, Detroit police officers raided a blind pig, which was an illegal after-hours operation at the Economy Printing Company. So there was this was during Vietnam, and there were some men, I believe they were getting ready to go off to Vietnam, so it was a going-away party. Police started then gathering at 12th and Claremont, and then started spreading to looting businesses there and all throughout the city. And Rosa Parks, by the way, lived not far from here on Longfellow Street. And the National Guard was called in, as well as the 82nd Airborne to squash the violence. The National Guard and the 82nd Airborne, they were mostly white soldiers, and some had just come back from Vietnam. They were not trained. A lot of them, along with the DPD, shut out the streetlights, creating even more panic. And then they were trying to say there were snipers on top of buildings and homes. 43 people died, 10 whites, and 33 were African American. That same summer, you also had insurrection in Newark, New Jersey, but the one in Detroit was the one that garnered most national attention and one of the deadliest. Getting back to civil rights, so by the time Dr. King had been assassinated, black nationalism was starting to escalate. Of course, you know about the Black Panthers. Well, there was a local group that was very similar in their tenets to the Black Panthers. It was called the Republic of New Africa. It was founded in 1968 by attorney Milton Henry, who changed his name to Bishop Jaramogi, Chokwe Lumumba, and Queen Mother Moore, who's the woman on the left, and this is attorney Milton Henry. They wanted 5 states in the South for a black separatist nation. So the Nation of Islam wanted to separate, but they did not want states. So the Republic of New Africa wanted to take it to the next level and have their own states. And those states were, as you see, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. On March 29th, during a meeting they had at New Bethel Baptist Church, they had the permission of Reverend Franklin, there was a shootout between them and the Detroit police. They took, no officers were killed, and they took all of the members downtown. Now, I don't think they took Reverend Franklin, but they took all the members downtown to 1300 Beaubien, the old police headquarters in Greektown, and Judge George Crockett, who was one of the first African-American judges for the Detroit Recorder's Court, ordered court at 1300 Beaubien. All members were free. He said they were violating their First Amendment rights to free speech and assembly. So after this, it led to Coleman Alexander Young. He was born in Alabama, migrated to Detroit, served as a Tuskegee Airman. Now, he did not fly overseas, but he was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was very active in the unions. He was elected to the Michigan State Senate in 1964. He did run in '69 against Roman Gribbs, the last white mayor at the time, but then won 4 years later and became the first African-American mayor elected in Detroit and served a 20-year tenure. So '73 was a magical year in Detroit because you had him elected, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, and then also Tom Bradley in Los Angeles. So Young and Bradley both served 20 years. Jackson, he served 2 terms and then went on to practice law, but then he came back to Atlanta and then had another stint back in the late 80s. The Renaissance Center was the pet project of Mayor Young. He, with Hank the Deuce, Henry Ford II, built the Renaissance Center. It was a hotel complex, shops, Ford Motor Company located their offices, and they would be in there until '97 when GM moved in from the new center, and then Ford took all their offices out of there and went out to Dearborn. But it's interesting how things are coming full circle because Ford is now going to have some operations in the old Michigan Central Station in Corktown. And also the Milner Center was built, the People Mover, Joe Louis Arena, because the Red Wings were looking at moving out to Pontiac. They wanted a massive sports complex in Pontiac with the Lions, Tigers, and Red Wings. Mayor Young said, I will have a city-owned arena downtown, and the Joe, of course, was torn down a few years ago. They have Little Caesars. And he also built, for the first time in a while, a lot of new apartments in the city, as well as new single-family homes. WGPR TV and radio. This was established in 1964 by the Free and Accepted Masons. The founder was Dr. William V. Banks. So this is a Masonic order. That's him right there on the left. And the Masons from this order had stations, radio stations around the country. The gentleman next to him is my grandfather, the late Ulysses Boykin. The second, he was vice president for government relations. So my grandfather was very involved with the Republican Party at the time, and back then they were for promoting African-American owned businesses. So through meetings he had going to the White House, he met with Nixon, and he met with Ford, of course, you know, who's from Grand Rapids, and Ford was a very good friend of his. He was able to get an FCC license, and in '75, WGPR became the first African-American commercially owned station in the United States. The Scene, which was a local dance show, paralleled Soul Train, and they would also simulcast it on the WGPR radio station. And they had programs that covered ethnic groups from other dynamics in the city. They were the first TV station in the city of Detroit to cover the growing Arab American population, because you know we have the largest Arab American population in the United States. So WGPR saw the potential in having public affairs shows with them and you know, music, okay, and movies. Unfortunately, the TV station met its demise in 1995. What was happening was Fox was a growing network, and Fox was mainly on UHF stations. So Fox used to be Channel 50. And so they swapped in 95 to Channel 2, and 62, the 62 you know now, CBS used to be WGPR, and it was a very low-powered station. So they had to increase the power of it so it could be reached over in Canada and as far south as Monroe. Now the radio station still exists, it's still African-American owned, and this is a picture of the original studio on East Jefferson, 5-minute drive from downtown. It's a city historical landmark and a state historical landmark, and actually the old studio is now a museum. So if you are ever in the city, it's free and open to the public. It has very limited hours of operation. They're only really open on, I think, Fridays and Saturdays, so go on their website to see when they're open, okay? Dennis Archer, the second African-American mayor in Detroit. He was born on the east side in 1942, and actually the family did move to Cassopolis in southwest Michigan, but then came back to Detroit. He graduated with a BA in education from Western Michigan. He taught in the Detroit Public Schools briefly. He obtained his law degree from Detroit College Law in 1970 and practiced law for 15 years. From 1986 to 1990, he served as a state Supreme Court justice. He was the second African-American to hold that position. And now we have our first female Supreme Court justice with the state, Kyra Harris Bolden. She was my former state rep out in Southfield, and she was appointed by Governor Whitmer. And he tried to work and bridge the divide between the city and suburbs, because there were still, you know, tensions with Coleman Young that had basically transitioned over to his administration. And then by the time he left office, he became the first African-American president of the American Bar Association. So 6 years prior to 2003, they did not allow African-American lawyers to be members of the American Bar Association, thus the formation of the National Bar Association, which is the African-American counterpart. So Dennis Archer, 60 years after they allowed their first African-American members in, he became their first African-American president, okay? So this time I will take any questions from the floor. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. He was the first African-American male president. They had a female president before him. Any questions from the floor? We've got about 20 minutes.
And if you do have any questions, because we are streaming and recording this, we would ask that you raise your hand. We'll pass you the microphone so your voice can also be heard on the stream as well as the recorded version.
And please give us your name too. Anybody? I know you guys have questions. So much insightful information was presented here this evening. Yes, sir.
My name is Michael.
Nice to meet you, Michael. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, hi. There were some African American, I think they were ballrooms and dance halls.
Yes.
And big performance centers where they brought in big bands and jazz groups.
Yeah, you had the Greystone Ballroom. Yeah, there was just so many.
Grandy Ballroom, was that one too?
I'm sorry. I heard of the 20 Grand. You had the Greystone. There were just so many all across the city on both sides of the city.
Are any of those still functioning as
No,
entertainment centers?
unfortunately, no. No, most of those ballrooms pretty much died, I would say, by the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. I think the 20 Grand, I think they were gone by the 70s, and then there was the Latin Quarters on West Grand Boulevard. That went up into the 80s, but yeah, a lot of them have pretty much met their demise. Now, you mentioned jazz. Detroit was a very big jazz town, too. Baker's is one of the oldest jazz clubs in the world, and also you have downtown, what is the name of that jazz club? Cliff Bell's, yes, Cliff Bell's is a prominent jazz club. But Baker's had internationally known stars that came, like Ella Fitzgerald and many others, and even white artists performed there too, so it was very, multicultural. Baker's, they almost closed, but it's still going strong.
One other question. I don't understand the origin of the relationship between Islam and the black community nationally and in Detroit. Was it only because of Farrakhan and his strong personality? Because historically, the African American community had been Christian and Baptist Christian and Southern Baptist. And I know that in Africa, in Northern Africa, it's mostly Islamic and there was a black Islamic influence. But there wasn't, my understanding is there wasn't any real history of it.
Well, let me explain. What happened was this was a black nationalist Pan-Africanist movement. Like Malcolm X, even before he joined the Nation of Islam, his father was a Garveyite, followed Marcus Garvey. So he had that spirit in him at that time, even prior to him going to prison, converting to the Nation of Islam. So the Nation of Islam was created because by that time, African Americans were getting frustrated with the Baptist Church, with the Catholic Church. They wanted their own religion. So that's why the Nation of Islam was created. But I'll say this, Malcolm and even Muhammad Ali, who Malcolm brought into the nation, later on they would learn that there were some fallacies that Elijah Muhammad created. Like when Malcolm went to Mecca for his pilgrimage, and this is when he was getting ready to leave the nation and go independent, he saw what Elijah Muhammad taught was a lie. He was saying that, all Muslims were, black. There were no white Muslims. He saw white Muslims, just Muslims from all around the world, different races, okay? So even Muhammad Ali, he had the same path as Malcolm. He later became a more orthodox Muslim. And Farrakhan took over the nation from Elijah Muhammad in 75. So that pretty much answers your question. But it was seen as a vessel, and even to this day, for African American men who are incarcerated, they see it as a way of trying to, change their lives and become more productive. Okay? Any other questions? Very good question. Thank you. Very pertinent question.
Hi, my name's Carolyn McCurry.
I'm sorry, is it Carolyn?
Carolyn.
Yes, nice to meet you, Carolyn.
Hi. In the early 70s, my brother-in-law was in a group of black Christian nationalists. They had a book. I read the book. I don't remember. He was dating the head guy's daughter, but I can't remember his name.
I think I know who you're talking about. I just can't get a grasp on. There's just so many groups.
I can't think of the name.
So many of them,
He was, and I'm not sure, I never talked to him like what they were. He was in the defense part of it. He was a Maccabee. And
okay.
Does that ring a bell?
Sort of. Like I said, there's so many movements and groups. Yeah. And I'm sure there's documentation on it too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, probably.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, there's so many movements.
But they had a book which I read, and
All right.
that's all.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, over here.
Jacqueline Malta is my name.
Good evening,
Thank you,
Jacqueline. Yes.
Professor. Black Bottom.
Yes.
A question that I have is when the infrastructure was reestablished with the highways, what did they do with the people there? Because it was predominantly African Americans.
They had no provisions to relocate them. They pretty much had to relocate on their own reconnaissance, unfortunately. And the movement went from Black Bottom to Oakland Avenue, right above there, which is a predominantly Jewish area.
Okay.
And then they went over on Linwood, and then eventually they would African-American businesses would move up to Livermore Avenue, which is now one of the largest, now known as the Avenue of Fashion, one of the largest African-American owned business districts in the whole United States. And I grew up in that area, and when I grew up over there, it was strong, but then it went on to decline. But now, since Duggan has been mayor, it has, just really revitalized itself. There are restaurants over there, and I mean, it looks great. It's like basically Detroit's version of Harlem, so to say, to put it as an analogy. And they want to try to recreate a Black Bottom downtown, but there's a lot of opposition to it. They're like, well, you've got Livermore Avenue, other parts of the city. You know, African Americans are 90% of the city. Why do we all have to be concentrated in one area? This is 2024. Let's be everywhere, you know. But they were like, well, we have a Greek town, we have a Cork town, we have a Chaldean town, you know. So that pretty much answers your question. They were not assisted with relocating. And that same thing in Richmond, the other cities I mentioned, they were not assisted at all.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Sophia, and
Welcome, Sophia. Thank you.
thank you.
Yes.
And I'm curious. You talked about when they built the I-94 like highway or I-75.
Yes, I-75.
Sorry, when they built the I-75 highway, and it went through Atlanta as well. You said, right?
Yes, Sweet Arbor is the community where Dr. King grew up. Yes, it cut Sweet Arbor. Now, Sweet Arbor is still in existence, but it's not as massive as it used to be. Arbor Avenue was the major thoroughfare, and you had like downtown Atlanta right here, and Sweet Arbor is over here. So part of Sweet Arbor went into the downtown area, but the freeway just sliced it in half.
Interesting. I mean, that's honestly. I was just curious if you could talk more about that, just because like I'm curious like how that has like if that highway is still affecting like the area today. Like I don't know what that looks like.
Last time I haven't been to Atlanta. I've been through Atlanta recently, but I've been to that Sweet Arbor area. But I mean, like they built a new Ebenezer Baptist Church back in the early 2000s. And they have the King Center, they're expanding it. But I've read articles in Atlanta, so they are revitalizing that area, building housing and all that. But the purpose, when the Interstate Highway Act was created under Eisenhower in the late 50s, he wanted a way to quickly get whites, this is when white flight was starting to happen, whites from the suburbs quickly into the city. So they did not want the freeways going through white areas of urban areas. They wanted to go through the black or African American or Latino areas of cities because they didn't see the value, in those properties. Okay, and in a lot of those cities, they've widened freeways too, and they've decimated African American and Latino areas. Like over on, it's funny you mentioned 94. They want to widen 94 to 8 lanes from Michigan Avenue all the way to the border at St. Clair Shores on the east side. And that would take away United Sound Studio, which was a recording studio where Aretha Franklin, George Clinton recorded. It's Ralph II, just north of Wayne State. So, and that's a state historical landmark. So when you have a state historical landmark, you want to build a freeway, be prepared to battle. Just like with the whole Little Caesars project, there were 2 hotels that were in that area that became state historical landmarks, and they said you have to develop them. You can't tear them down, okay? So a lot of politics are involved in this, as you can see. But very good question, yes.
Yeah. And I do have a second question just about, I can't remember exactly what it was called. It was like the state of New Africa.
Republic of New Africa.
The Republic of New Africa.
Yes.
I'm curious. You were talking about like how they had like similar like black nationalist kind of ideas to the Black Panther Party. And I'm curious, like, what are the key differences between those groups, and also like what was the rationale between having that like those like 5 states in the South?
Well, they were different than the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam just wanted to live separate from white America and not have their own states. But the Republic of New Africa wanted to take it to another level because they felt like they were entitled to having land. Because African Americans had land during Reconstruction. We had 40 acres and a mule. The federal government gave allotments to African Americans, within 3 or 4 years, they could own land. So that they were looking at that as the reason why, they should have a separatist nation. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? We've got about 6 minutes here. Anybody? Very good questions. Anyone? One thing before we get to the next question, if you really want to get the African American history experience, of course, go to the Charles Wright Museum, but also take the Black Scroll Network tour. Black Scroll, SCROLL Network. You'll see all the sites where slaves were in Detroit, and the gentleman who runs it, his name is Jamon Jordan. He's the official historian for the city of Detroit, and actually, he teaches a course right over here in Ann Arbor at U of M on the history of Detroit. He's been teaching out here in Ann Arbor like the last 2 years. So definitely take that tour. I mean, there's so much history in Detroit. Yes, there's another question over here.
No.
Oh.
Please tell me his name again.
Jamon Jordan, Black Squirrel Network. Black Squirrel Network. Oh, one other thing I want to say before you think of another question. I mean, Detroit has been, just a total trailblazer for African Americans. I mean, we did not only make an impact locally, but nationally and internationally. And, the rest of the country or the world always wants to demonize Detroit, but Detroit has birthed so many brilliant minds in politics, in law, in education, in entertainment, especially with Motown. I mean, Motown is just a brilliant innovation that changed the whole scope of music and brought the country together. And it's interesting, we look at the history of Motown, like I said, the artists were from Detroit, mostly African American. It was during segregation, and they had not experienced segregation until they went down south. When they would go to a concert hall or a gymnasium, whites would be on one side and African Americans would be on the other side of the rope. So it wasn't until the late 60s when they took down the rope. Like if you saw the movie, like the Temptations movie, okay, you would see they dramatized that, all right? So you can imagine, I mean, another thing too is Berry Gordy used this marketing technique. He wanted so bad to get white patrons of the artists. For the first several years of Motown, he would not put the actual faces of the artists on the record covers. And it wasn't just Motown, it was other labels too, because they wanted a crossover audience. They felt if they had a picture of an African American group, whites in the South would not buy, their records. Okay? Yes.
I'm curious if you could talk more about the relationship between Dr. King and Berry Gordy and like how that came about. Like I know they were both like just very influential figures.
Yes.
But I'm like curious like what more there was to that like made it so that what I mean, like there was that huge the first I had tribute being here.
Well, Berry Gordy, he saw how much potential there was to record Dr. King's speech. He was so focused on music. But it's interesting because years later, in the early 70s, when Marvin Gaye came out with the What's Going On album, it became one of Motown's best-selling albums. Berry Gordy didn't want Marvin Gaye to record it at first. He said it was too political. And Marvin Gaye was like, you have to record it because it was during the Vietnam era. And Berry Gordy had second thoughts and recorded, and like I said, it's one of the top-selling albums with Motown. So yes, Berry Gordy was very involved in civic activities, but like I said, I just had to bring up the thing with Marvin Gaye where he was kind of iffy about it. And it was a crossover hit. I mean, everybody was listening to that song all around the world because he had Vietnam going on and still the aftermath of the civil rights movement, okay? Any other questions or comments about anything? Anyone else? Anyone else got about 5 minutes here? Anyone? Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about the history of Detroit, and I know there's been tremendous investment in Detroit, and you mentioned different pockets. Can you project into the future of how you see Detroit, down the road as far as growth, development? And one of the biggest problems is the school system.
Oh, sure. It's anywhere, yeah. That's a very good question, and we'll end on that. I'm not Nostradamus, but I can honestly say it's going to be interesting within the next 10, 20 years in the history of the city of Detroit. We're seeing a population shift. We had white flight in the 60s, and now we're having people from the suburbs come back in, but what's happening now is that a lot of indigenous Detroiters who have been there for generations are being priced out. So things are changing, and I want to see a city where whites, Arabs, people of all races can get together, but it all starts with the politics, who you put in office, and you talk about the school system. When I graduated from Cass Tech in 1994, DPS was the 5th largest school system in the country after Philadelphia. They had about 230,000 students. By 2000, they had under 100,000. I think now they barely have 40,000. Most of the parents are sending their kids to charter schools. So I don't know what's going to happen with the school system, because what's happening now is, let's look at the age demographic of people who are moving to the city, especially whites. Most are in their 20s, 30s, and don't have kids. And by the time they want to get married and have kids, they may not want to stay in Detroit and move back out to the suburbs. So, like you said, schools are an important component of where you live. And so until the time comes when more investment is put into the DPS, the couples that will be moving the city will be basically childless, okay? So that's what I foresee. Right now the population is about 670,000. I just looked at the census from 2020. We're now the 20th largest city in the United States. Used to be the 5th largest until about 1990, and then 2000 we were at 973. So right now we're steady at 670,000. I don't know if it's going to go back up exponentially. That has yet to be seen. But yeah, it's very interesting, like I said, when you look at the history of the city. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I have a very weak question.
No question is a weak question. I tell my students, there's no such thing as a silly or weak question.
Okay.
And we'll close on your questions.
My
about
name is
7:20.
Tom. A close friend of ours was ill today. She wasn't able to come. She wanted to be here.
Sorry to hear that. Well, she can watch this on, replay.
Okay.
On
Yeah. And how do we get this on replay?
It's on the Ann Arbor District Library. If you go to our YouTube channel.
You go to the YouTube channel.
Go to the event link for this. The stream will be up pretty quickly afterwards. But easiest way is the AADL Air YouTube channel.
Okay.
Yes, go
Thank
ahead.
you. That was it.
Okay,
I told you
all
it was
right.
weak.
Okay. All right. So once again, it was an honor to come out here. I hope you can see this. If you would like for me to come speak to your church, community group, or employer, or your children's school, I will be more than happy to oblige. There's my phone number. That's my personal and business number. There's my email address. I'm also on LinkedIn, Peter Boykin, and Facebook. So if you just want to contact me about learning more tidbits about African American history, I'll be glad to point you towards some resources. And by the way, there's a good program I'm going to try to get back home to with the next 50 minutes on National Geographic. They have this program called Genius. It's on Dr. King and Malcolm X. It's called Genius X MLK. It's been on for the last several weeks. It's very good. It looks at the